Okay, yes, recording is on. So, the presentation for tonight is Pandemic Connectivity for Ontario Students, and the province of Ontario has announced iPads and free data deployed for Ontario learners to connect during the pandemic, and we're going to take a look at internet access in relation to human rights and how the universal internet access for Canadians can be understood in light of the connectivity responses that have been triggered by this particular crisis. And we're hearing from Karen Louise Smith, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication, Popular Culture, and Film at Brock University. And I'm very interested and eager to hear to hear the presentation. So without any further ado, Karen, I'm pretty sure, just a sec. I'm pretty sure that you're going to be able to share without any further issues. Yep, it's wide open for you to share your screen at this point.
Okay. So thanks so much to Civic Tech Toronto for the Zoom invitation to join everyone here today. Basically what I'm going to be speaking about tonight is some work that I started in the spring. At the time, the Ontario government made a policy announcement about free iPads and free data plans for learners enrolled in junior kindergarten to grade 12 education here in the province. So the policy decision that I've just alluded to, it really read across newspapers and outlets that reported on it as being about free iPads and free data plans. In terms of headlines, CP24 stated that Ontario was going to give iPads with free data to 21,000 students who lack access. And in terms of the official press release from the province, which was accompanied by a press conference where Premier Ford and Minister Lecce both spoke, the same kind of details were shared with some additional information, of course. So those 21,000 iPads were highlighted. The free Rogers LTE data was emphasized. And right in the first sentence, there starts to be mention in the press release about a partnership and cooperation with Rogers Communications and Apple to help meet the educational needs of Ontario learners. So when this hit the news and when I started to hear some sound bites about this, I was very intrigued because I have a long-term interest in the connectivity programs and the connectivity policies that have existed in Canada. And it actually struck me as a really, really low number of iPads and devices that were being distributed. So I was curious right off the bat about why this number of iPads was being celebrated when it seemed so low. So I crunched some numbers on a really, really quick basis. And there are over 2 million learners enrolled in the education system, the K-12 education system in Ontario. And 21,000 iPads is really just enough to reach about 1% of the learners. So it's a really small, small measure in terms of the number of learners in the system. But what the statistic doesn't really tell us is how many students might be lacking connectivity, how many students might not have a device to access online resources during the pandemic, or how many learners might not have good, robust broadband access at home, either through an Ethernet cable, another kind of coaxial cable, or through something provided through wireless, like an LTE data plan. So in terms of thinking about the kinds of numbers and what the connectivity gaps are in Canada, I went to a CRTC policy report from 2019 that has all kinds of usage statistics about internet in Canada. And it shared within that report that a total of 14.4% of Ontario households lack broadband access entirely. The percentage with no access, I believe it was 1.6, and the remaining amount of that 14.4% was made up of those individuals who can only purchase slow access at 5 megabits per second. So a 5 megabits per second connection is generally not fast enough to make use of video conferencing like a Zoom call like we're on right now, or to make use of cloud computing systems. And all of the virtual learning environments that are used by school boards, things like Google Classroom, things like Desire to Learn, Brightspace, any of these systems that are either called virtual learning environments or learning management systems, they use cloud-based document storage and cloud computing more broadly, and a 5 megabits per second connection just isn't going to cut it to use those kinds of applications in most cases. So this number of 21,000 iPads, which was celebrated, really struck me as a little bit odd in some ways. So I was curious to dive a little deeper and to see what would happen as attempts to instantiate universal access for Ontario learners as school boards tried to make that real, you know, where the rubber hits the road and people tried to make this happen in the world. I wanted to follow this and trace what would happen as best as I could as a scholar. In terms of the human rights issues and the framing issues that support internet access in relation to human rights, there was a statement made in the General Assembly in the United Nations in 2016, and there's many clauses to this statement. Quite often when it's reported in the news, there's a headline that says something like the United Nations declared internet access a human right. But if you look at the fine print and the many clauses, what the UN said really, my interpretation of it is that the internet facilitates and is a component of instantiating our human rights in many different ways and in relation to multiple rights. If we translate this to the Canadian context, we have our charter, and within the Constitution, the idea that we have freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including the freedom of press and other media of communication. And where policy has most immediately tried to make sense of what internet access means for Canadians in relation to our rights is in relation to the universal service objectives, which have been articulated by the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission, the CRTC. And the CRTC in Policy Decision 496 in 2016, they set up something called the Universal Service Objectives, or the USOs, for Canada. And within the USOs, the idea that people really need a 50 megabits per second download and a 10 megabits per second upload broadband connection and unlimited data, that was set as a universal service objective, as well as the idea that people need access to the latest mobile technologies and to be able to access data through those connections, whether they're in homes, personal homes, or whether they're on roads and traveling about the country. So through this lens of internet access being really important to operationalize and make real our human rights and things like children's right to an education, I was curious how Ontario's plan to deploy and to distribute 21,000 iPads, as well as these LTE data plans from Rogers, really how that would play out as different school boards attempted to implement access for their learners. So in terms of some of my academic work, I'm using a universal access model, which was developed by Andrew Clement and Leslie Shade, called the Access Rainbow. And really what the Access Rainbow is all about, it's about the social and technical aspects that are needed to make internet access or our connectivity happen. And for us to experience all of the potential benefits of universal access, ideas like the governance of the internet, as well as having access to devices like a mouse and a computer, the model includes those social and technical aspects. So really what I'd like to suggest is that the pandemic has acted like a prism, and it's allowed us to see these different elements of access, the social aspects and the technical aspects, and some of the tensions about some of the contextual issues at play, they're really brought into focus by the pandemic. So many of you are probably familiar with Naomi Klein and her idea of the shock doctrine or disaster capitalism. So on the one hand, there's an idea that an event like a pandemic could act as a facilitator for privatization and for potentially some of the corporate interests of the internet, for those to be strengthened by an event like the pandemic. That's one possibility. There's also the possibility that a lot of the community goals, a lot of the goals towards well-being and empowerment that community groups may have for the internet, that those may be better realized through a moment like the pandemic, where people can do their best to really instantiate those values that are a part of the systems that they use. So I'm going to be looking at how these 21,000 iPads and the Rogers LTE data plans, how those connect and how those map in relation to what people did to facilitate access in the spring for learners in Ontario. And I know we're just, a few days before the start of the school year. So anyone who has students or children in the K-12 system, I realize this may not be the most pressing issue for you at the moment. But I'm going to just keep on trekking on to see what kind of thoughts Civic Tech TO has to share with me on these ideas. So in terms of investigating or exploring this situation in greater depth, what I did was I purposively, and that really just means that I went and found data wherever I could that looked interesting. I purposively sampled what happened in relation to over 704,000 learners in Ontario who were a part of 12 school boards. This represents about 35% of the learners in Ontario. And I looked at school boards that I could find news coverage on about the deployment of iPads and free data. So really, I could only report what I could find, and I was in some ways limited by where this became a news story and in what regions of the province this became a news story. So in total, I examined 12 school boards that correspond to the different regions on the map. And I've just put one city from each of these school boards. There are other cities involved in some of these school boards as well, but just to give you an idea of where they were located across the province. So I looked at a range of public and Catholic boards. I also included a French language board, and I tried to include urban as well as more rural and northern parts of the province to try and have some different kinds of data, some different kinds of stories about how connectivity was instantiated. I can only share really a few highlights of what I found in looking into this. But interestingly, one of the first things that I found out was that this was actually not about just iPads. So although the press release really highlighted a partnership between Rogers and Apple and the Ontario government and the school boards, there were actually far more Chromebooks that I could find news coverage and discussion of the distribution of Chromebooks as devices within school boards. So there was also sometimes difficulty in parsing out how many of each devices were available. The Toronto District School Board is one example of that, where news coverage simply listed that there were 50,000 Chromebooks and iPads. The numbers were differentiated for the Catholic Board with 6,000 Chromebooks, oh, pardon me, I'm wrong. That's not one of the cases where they were differentiated. My apologies. I also made a point of looking at what kind of percentage of the learners in the school boards were receiving devices. So it looks like about 20% of the learners in the TDSB required devices. 6.6% may have received with the figures that I was able to gather for the Toronto Catholic District Board. And then I also took note of things like which virtual learning environment, and that just means which kind of software provider school boards were using to deliver and engage curriculum for their learners. I mentioned the access rainbow and its social and technical aspects. So starting at the top is that question of governance. And then at the bottom, we end up with carriage, which we might want to think about as the wires and cables or the plumbing that brings all of our connectivity into existence. And then in the middle, there's a range of other kinds of elements, including literacy and social facilitation, content, devices. And what I'm going to do is just quickly dive through a couple of the key issues in relation to the access rainbow that I was able to uncover by my purposive sampling of news stories, as well as really internet-based research around the facts and figures that I was finding reported. So in terms of carriage, from the bottom of the access rainbow, one of the challenges that this work uncovered was that the iPads and the LTE data plans are unfortunately not sufficient to entirely correct the digital divide in Ontario. So there's locations in Ontario that don't have LTE coverage, and therefore the kind of solution that was represented in the press release, it's not adequate. So one place where this applies, I looked at a school board that's headquartered in Thunder Bay, and outside of Thunder Bay, there's a town called Nakina, and you cannot get LTE coverage there. So this would not help you if you were a learner in Nakina and you were lacking broadband or data at home. In terms of devices, I've already foreshadowed this finding, but it's not about just the iPads. Although that's the partnership that was highlighted in the press release, there were also massive numbers of Chromebooks that were being distributed across Ontario. And I was able to find mention of over, I think I've got a typo on that slide, which I'll have to correct later. But I was able to find that there were more Chromebooks than iPads being distributed in the province. The third issue that I'd like to highlight is around software. I mentioned that I looked into those virtual learning environments that school boards were using, and 8 out of the 12 boards that were examined were using Google as VLE to a varying degree. All of those boards that were distributing Chromebooks, I was also able to find that they use Google Education VLE as part of their system. So that hardware software connection potentially makes a lot of sense. And what does this all mean as we start to piece together how access was operationalized in the early phases of the pandemic in Ontario? In terms of some of the things that happened in school boards, there was a massive amount of labor at the middle levels, the upper middle levels of the access rainbow, for school boards to do things like sanitize, to strip personal information from devices that was there, to transport devices to families or to arrange pickups for them within schools and other locations. There was a massive amount of labor to facilitate access that was operationalized in all kinds of different ways in different locations around the province. That amount of work isn't really seen in the press release. There was also a massive amount of work by school boards to try to be equitable and to be respectful of students in all kinds of diverse ways. This includes creating help materials in multiple languages to serve families who are perhaps newcomers to Canada. This includes things like including content that's appropriate for Indigenous learners, to have contact points with elders. So there were massive amounts of ideas and creativity which were a part of operationalizing access in ways that go just beyond the devices and data, but to try and really meet a lot of the aspects of what Clement and Shade laid out in the Access Rainbow in their work from earlier connectivity efforts in Canada. If we start to think about some of those potentially more disaster capitalism interpretations or takes on what was happening here, I've just listed a number of the ways that really equity and empowerment approaches were attempted by school boards and educators. But if we turn our attention to issues of disaster capitalism, it becomes a possibility to think about how partnerships and how business opportunities of procurement are a part of connectivity. And there's also this idea beyond the labor that was conducted by educators and by school boards trying to support equity goals. There's also an ongoing tension in relation to privatization, which is present in this kind of scenario. So corporations, companies like Google, companies like Microsoft, companies like Desire to Learn, as well as all kinds of hardware providers, they sell products and services to school boards. And one thing that we need to keep in mind within this kind of setting is that youth data is potentially very valuable to these corporations. And I look to work by people like Audrey Waters, who have pointed to the idea of data as the new oil in relation to student data in learning analytics systems. And in a moment of a pandemic, it's virtually impossible for families to opt out of using devices if they have them. But simultaneously, we have the challenge of families that are being left out who don't have the choice if they lack hardware and data to get connected. So it's complicated terrain. There are lots of issues at play, but I was really intrigued to see the other day that education is by no means the only sector where some of these tensions are at play. Many of you probably saw the news story about the possibility for low-performing bus routes in Toronto, for there to be provincial push towards using micro-transit, aka Uber or Lyft type services, to fill the gap in transit if bus routes, for example, were to be canceled. And this kind of replacement of the public with the private with intensive datification is something that I think the Civic Tech Toronto community is probably interested in. And I'd really just love to continue the conversation and to hear your thoughts.
Know if it's kosher to unmute the clap.
Thank you. Yeah, that was.
Okay, that's great. Give us a lot to talk about. Karen, do you want to just stop sharing
share?
now,
Yeah.
so we can all see each other?
Yeah, I found the button.
And then I will. Okay. There are a number of questions that have been dropped into the chat, and I'll just read the first one that I can see for you, if you don't mind. Was the iPad distribution based on household income or a related metric, and do we have open data on where they went?
Okay, so that is a great question. Really, each school board made their own decisions about how devices were deployed and whether they would purchase new ones. So many school boards made use of existing devices that they already had to deploy to learners. And some school boards had to purchase or chose to purchase additional devices. There were differences in various regions. In Ottawa, for example, there's mention of hotspots being purchased that aren't explicitly described as the LTE data plans within the iPads with the Rogers-Apple partnership. So they may have got a stick or some other kind of hotspot device. But really, school boards seem to have surveyed parents in their own boards and made their own determinations around what was needed. So, you know, a family with 4 children in Ottawa might have been treated differently than a family with 4 children in Thunder Bay that had low bandwidth in the home, for example. But there weren't any consistent criteria that emerged. In relation to open data, there is none on this at this point in Ontario. A data set could be created by filing freedom of information type requests with the school boards. I'm personally not interested in doing that at this time because I'm busy and I'm happier to work with the rough news data. I don't think it's the right time to put that administrative burden on boards at this particular moment, but I do think it would be valuable information to have. And I have seen some data sets emerging in the UK in this similar space. And, you know, everyone released their bus routes eventually. So maybe we'll end up with that kind of culture around sharing data about connectivity for learners.
Thank you. There was a question dropped in by Brent Manuel about how you get access to this program because he has a friend with school-age kids. And I would assume that that basically applies to Toronto if you happen to know the answer.
In terms of practical advice, the schools were sending out surveys in the spring to families, and also calling and connecting with families through the telephone. But the most immediate way, if you know of a family that needs help, I would recommend getting them to call the principal of the principal at their home school to try and get some assistance. I think that's the most direct way to follow up.
Okay, and that would apply to any school board, is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, because Brett just said it was Ottawa, sorry. Got a question from Pat Con about whether the initiatives seem to be driven by device makers rather than the government.
That's a great question. I don't know why the provincial government in Ontario chose to highlight this partnership with Apple and Rogers. I suspect there's some reason that it was beneficial for them to highlight that particular partnership, because I suspect a large number of Chromebooks were also procured in the same time period. I suspect that there was a discount that school boards took advantage of, and Chromebooks could have just as easily appeared in the press release by my estimation and by my reading of the devices that were deployed. But why the particular relationship with Apple and Rogers was highlighted, I can't say.
Thank you. Let's see. Sorry.
Yeah, and thank you so much for reading the questions, because it's helping a lot.
I don't see any other questions in the chat, and I don't see any other cues dropped into the chat. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and ask one of my own. Some time ago, there was a discussion, which I actually thought had made some considerable progress towards being realized, about making relatively high bandwidth data available through the Canadian North via a satellite link system. Do you know anything about that? Was the intention was the intention followed up on? Did it happen?
I am not an expert on satellite connectivity in the North. I know that there is some that covers certain regions, but I can't speak knowledgeably to that question, unfortunately.
Okay. Ushnish asks, do I have that pronounced right? Not hearing, sorry. Ushnish asks if there's any initiative that avoids the Microsoft or Google near duopoly on productivity apps, so the kids don't grow up thinking those are the only options.
Yeah, that's a great question. And this idea really of students becoming users of a particular product, really they become early consumers when that's what they learn. So that's a really interesting question. I think the competitor in many ways to a lot of these incumbents is the Waterloo-based Desire to Learn company, which makes the Brightspace virtual learning environment. So the Ontario government has procured that virtual learning environment for all school boards to be able to access. But interestingly, what my research shows is that's not the default virtual learning environment that school boards are using. So even though there's been a big province-wide procurement, boards are still interested in using other systems. And it could be just because teachers have become familiar with Google Classroom, or they've become familiar with the Microsoft offerings, which are being used in educational settings. That may be the reason, but there are some systems that disrupt, or Canadian companies that are present in this ecosystem. But your point is well taken that many of the big tech brands are very prominent and remain prominent.
Okay. I'd just like to emphasize one more time that if people are okay, Oshnish has another question, I believe. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah. Hi, Karen. The other concern I would have is in terms of the model for internet access. If the model is always going with the big providers, not kind of local networks, or even kind of teaching maybe the kids how to build mesh networks and things like that, that the model they get used to is, hey, the way you access the internet is through Bell and Rogers, and those are the only two, that's the universe of internet access that we know and we've grown up with. Is any kind of projects out there? I know of the projects with, like Toronto mentioned, how it's more about adults. Any projects at the school, or more kind of younger age, that's encouraging people at a younger age to learn more about alternative internet access systems? Yeah.
So thanks so much for that question. I feel like I have to give a nod to the fact I worked on digital literacy programs for youth in Toronto between 2013 and 2015 with Mozilla, amongst a range of community partners, including 6 public library systems and museums across Toronto and the GTA. And there are absolutely a ton of efforts to expose and introduce youth to maker culture. And I think the fact that we see things like maker spaces in schools is an attempt to show them that they can build their own technologies and that they can make the world that they want to live in many different kinds of ways. But I think it's an ongoing struggle for young people, and I'm basing this statement on a range of projects that I've been involved in. I think it's a real struggle for young people to feel like they can break open a computer and hack it, and to give them the power and autonomy to really build what they want to build. And things like the fact that there is no right to repair, that we buy computers that are difficult to open, and that the warranties are voided if we touch the insides. None of those things, in my opinion, really assist young people to become makers and creators. They're ways to kind of bound up intellectual property and to kind of thwart that creativity. But I think there are absolutely attempts and people who are trying to work with young people to make that a reality.
Okay, Curtis wanted had a comment, I think, or
Yeah, it might be of interest to the community. I've been trying to keep closer tabs on Toronto Mesh recently, um, which is a group that started at Civic Tech Toronto, which is based around providing like access and educational materials, workshops, and stuff around alternative internet access through like peer-to-peer mesh networking. And your point about the two kind of like dual sides of disaster capitalism really got me thinking of this, because lately what I've noticed happening there is that they've been getting a lot more traction recently because they've been sticking close to large telecom providers like Cisco, who are providing a lot of the hardware that's being used to like kind of support a lot of the like donations that Rogers and Bell are making in Toronto. So they're lighting up towers basically for free, donating backhaul. And Cisco is donating routers, Meraki routers to that, which have like a relatively short lifespan. I think they're within 5 years, they'll be absolutely useless. And what I've come to understand is that like a lot of the ISPs are doing this as a kind of short-term project. They're not interested in sustaining these long-term. But what Toronto Mesh has been able to do recently is use the access, because the city won't really treat them as like a kind of, they're not really able to interact with the city or with public servants in ways that kind of like generate fruitful partnerships. But what they have been able to do is get up on the roofs following Cisco and install their own hardware and nodes alongside those. So for the first time in possibly ever now, there's like a large supernode, Toronto Mesh supernode on one of the buildings in Toronto. I think it's on Woolner Street, Woolner in North Toronto, with which has like a 2.5 kilometer coverage. And there's more potentially supernodes on the way in St. Jamestown, possibly the Crossways, and there's another one that I'm drawing a blank on, something Court. But I find it very interesting, like how, and I thought it'd be worth remarking on how, like, actually those two forces are kind of working like towards some of the same ends at this point. And the hope for Toronto Mesh's perspective is that they'll be able to like get a foot in the door with some of this, to install some of their own hardware and infrastructure, and then play the long game around like supporting access and education around those kind of technologies.
I was super interested to hear all of that, and I think that point around being able to get on the rooftops just is so dramatic in demonstrating, like to make access public. You have to be able to get through a locked stairwell to get to a location that is a little precarious to get to any other way, and really getting through those locked doors and through those system access points it just demonstrates how challenging it is, and all of the ways that there's blockages put in place, so that really there's the kind of a default towards corporate and incumbent providers. I actually have a question here that I have for the group. So I'm just going to throw it in the chat, and then I would love to hear if there's any thoughts on this. But I'm just curious, really, if the group has come across any other examples of kind of privatization of or technology in the pandemic era. So, you know, I've run through some of the cases where it's happening in relation to education, where that kind of datification push through devices and through software is happening. But that kind of example that emerged with the TTC and potential Uber use, have people come across anything else along those lines? It's a tough one. I don't have any other examples myself, so.
I mean, uh, it's maybe a silly one, but I mean, like, literally all the communication tools that everyone is flooding on to are kind of doing that because we lost the best technology we had in physical space, and they're all trying to reproduce. I don't know. It's a little silly.
It was kind of like, you know, the rise of Zoom. I think that also is a potential example here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe
Well,
that-
thanks for sharing.
I mean, there's kind of been a push towards, I think often in terms of like alcohol sales and how those have moved like primarily from like alcohol vendors in Ontario, like they have kind of, it's moved from like primarily state actors or state supported cartels to like not just distributors now, but like private businesses are kind of like keeping themselves afloat on alcohol sales. And many of them are now moving to like a kind of like alcohol import model. Which like is a direct, like kind of, it's not necessarily a privatization, but it like injects competition with like a state supported, with the state supported LCBO.
Certainly, the move to privatized beer delivery was kind of noticeable, and not entirely unwelcome under the circumstances. You can now get beer delivered directly from most microbreweries just by within a couple of days, which is nice if you like beer.
Perfect.
Not,
Well, thank you
yeah.
to everyone for letting me share this work in progress. I think it'll probably appear in an open access academic journal called Social Studies for Social Justice sometime in early 2021. There's actually a paper version that goes along with this, but it was super helpful for me to get to talk aloud the work that I've been doing in this space, and it's so valuable to share it with a group that cares about the issues and themes.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you have this available on the, if you have the slides available and you're interested in sharing them, please feel free to drop a link in the chat.
Okay, I don't have them posted anywhere right now, but I can do that and follow up.
Oh, thank you. Okay, well, the next stage of our regular evening is announcements and pitches. So I'm just going to share my screen and go over to announcements and pitches. And one of our organizers is going to be editing this for us. So a shout out to Sam. And just a sec. And I think maybe we can go. Okay. You should be seeing now a document called the main announcements and pitches. And if you have an announcement, we'll pop the announcement into we'll pop the details of the announcement into the document, and people can take a look at it. And after that, we'll do pitches if anybody's got a pitch. And I'm looking at Pat Kahn, who looks like he has something to say.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to share that since May, the project called Polis, which is a technology that's been open